When Eduardo Garcia, millionaire of Spain's largest real estate empire, decided to pretend to be on his deathbed in his mansion in La Moraleja, he thought he would finally discover who in his family truly loved him and who was just waiting for his death to collect their inheritance. What he discovered in those 72 hours of simulation was so devastating that when he got up from bed to reveal the truth, nothing in the Garcia family would ever be the same again. Because sometimes when you play with the fire of truth, you end up burning everything you believed in. It was a cold December morning when Eduardo Garcia, 72 years old, patriarch of the Garcia Associates real estate empire with a fortune of 900 million euros, woke up in his sumptuous mansion in La Moraleja with a decision that would forever change his family. Contemplating the artisanal ceiling of his bedroom decorated with 17th century frescoes, Eduardo felt the weight of a life dedicated to building an empire that perhaps none of his heirs truly deserved. The suspicions he had nurtured for years had become certainty the previous week when he heard his son Carlos whisper to his brother Miguel in the main hall of the mansion. The words had pierced Eduardo's heart like icy daggers, confirming his worst fears about his children's true feelings toward him. Eduardo had 3 children. Carlos, 45 years old, director of operations of the company with his wife Isabel, always so solicitous, but with that calculating smile. Miguel, 42 years old, responsible for international expansion with his girlfriend Sofia, an Andalusian model, and Alejandro, 38 years old, the rebel who had always refused to work in the family business to follow his passion for flamenco art. The idea that was maturing in the elderly businessman's mind was as brilliant as it was cruel. He would pretend to be gravely ill on the brink of death to observe the true reactions of his family members without masks or hypocrisy. Who would show genuine love? Who would have already started calculating the inheritance? Dr. Mendoza, his personal physician for 20 years, was initially reluctant to accept Eduardo's plan, but finally agreed to play the role of the doctor announcing a terminal diagnosis. Ramon, his trusted personal assistant, installed hidden cameras throughout the mansion to record every conversation and every gesture when family members believed they were alone. On the morning of December 15th, Eduardo put his plan into motion. He called Carlos with a weak voice, feigning a sudden collapse. Within an hour, the entire family had gathered at the mansion, all with apparently worried expressions. Dr. Mendoza arrived with his black briefcase and the grave air of one bearing bad news. After a false, exhaustive consultation, the doctor went downstairs to communicate the invented diagnosis to the family. Advanced pancreatic cancer, 3 weeks to live at most. The silence that followed was deafening, and Eduardo, pretending to sleep but listening to everything through the intercom, clearly heard reactions that chilled him. Not only tears, but also what seemed like a sigh of relief from someone. It was the beginning of a test that would reveal truths more bitter than any real illness. The first night of his feigned terminal state opened Eduardo's eyes to a reality he never would have wanted to see. Lying in his bed with eyes half closed, he watched the family members take turns in his room, each believing they were alone with an unconscious, dying man. Isabel was the first devastating revelation. She sat beside the bed, taking his hand with apparent tenderness, but her eyes showed no pain. They showed pure calculation. Her gaze continuously moved toward the cabinet of important documents, toward the hidden safe, toward valuable objects. When she believed Eduardo was sleeping deeply, Isabel rose silently and began rummaging through the papers on the desk, evidently searching for the will or information about bank accounts. Carlos entered shortly after and pulled Isabel away from the desk, but not out of moral indignation. His whispered words in the hallway devastated Eduardo. The concern was not about Isabel's inappropriate behavior, but about the inappropriate timing. They should wait for him to die in peace. Afterward, they would have all the time to deal with the inheritance. Miguel arrived in the middle of the night from Barcelona, and his first concern was not his father's condition, but organizing an urgent meeting with his brothers to discuss the situation. Eduardo heard him telephone what seemed to be a lawyer, asking for information on how to contest an unsatisfactory will. But the most painful stab came from Alejandro, whom Eduardo had always considered the most honest for his refusal to work in the company. When he thought no one could hear him, Alejandro confided to his partner Sofia that he would finally be free of that burden, and that with his share of the inheritance, he could open the flamenco tablao in Seville he had always dreamed of. The second night brought the most devastating discovery of all. The three brothers met in the main hall, believing that Eduardo was sleeping deeply under the effect of non-existent sedatives. The conversation that followed completely destroyed the illusions Eduardo still harbored about his children. Carlos spoke with the cold tone of the calculating businessman. They had to be realistic. Their father had always threatened to leave everything to charity if they weren't up to par. They had to make sure that in his final days he felt loved, so he wouldn't change the will at the last moment. Miguel revealed he had already consulted lawyer Herrera to contest eventual testamentary modifications, arguing that their father wasn't lucid due to his illness. Alejandro, the son Eduardo thought was the purest of heart, added the phrase that definitively be her son, broke the old patriarch's heart. Their father had lived too long. He should have retired years ago and let them manage the company. Eduardo felt the world collapse. His children, for whom he had sacrificed everything, couldn't wait for him to die. There was no love, gratitude, or genuine affection, only ruthless calculations, barely disguised greed, and impatience to finally get their hands on his inheritance. The test was revealing a family he no longer recognized, and the worst was yet to come. The third day of that macabre performance brought revelations that exceeded even Eduardo's darkest expectations. The hidden cameras captured betrayals that went far beyond simple greed for inheritance, revealing a web of deceptions that had transformed his family into a nest of vipers. Isabel, believing herself alone in the library while Eduardo slept, made a phone call that chilled the old businessman's blood. The daughter-in-law, whom he had considered like a daughter, was having an extramarital affair and was waiting for Eduardo's death to reveal everything and move to Marbella with her lover. Carlos, the betrayed husband, suspected nothing, still convinced he had a devoted wife by his side. The discovery about Miguel was equally shocking, but of a different nature. His relationship with Sofia, the beautiful Andalusian model he had presented as the love of his life, was completely fake. Eduardo discovered through the recordings that Miguel was paying Sofia 200,000 euros to play the role of a loving girlfriend, at least until the reading of the will. The model, bored with this comedy, was only waiting for the end of the show to collect her payment and disappear. But the deepest betrayal came from Carlos, the son in whom Eduardo had placed the greatest hopes as his natural successor. While believing himself alone in his office, Carlos conducted a series of phone calls that revealed a betrayal that transcended the family sphere. He was selling commercial secrets of the company to foreign competitors, already planning to dismantle the Garcia empire as soon as he took control. The recorded calls showed Carlos promising the sale of premium properties in Madrid for 50 million below market value, betraying not only his father, but also 3 generations of family sacrifices. The son, who was supposed to inherit and protect the company, was literally selling everything off before Eduardo had even died. Alejandro, whom Eduardo thought was at least honest in his rebellion, proved to be the most ruthless of all. Not only had he already put valuable objects from the mansion up for sale online, but he had also contacted the press to sell the story of real estate magnate Eduardo Garcia's death to gossip magazines. He wanted the world to know what kind of tyrant his father had been, defining his imminent death as liberation for everyone. The situation reached its climax when Eduardo discovered that even his beloved grandchildren, Carlos's children, had been transformed into little marionettes by cynical parents. Isabel had instructed the children on how to behave during their grandfather's illness, to pretend sadness, tell him how much they loved him, all orchestrated to ensure he wouldn't change his will. The children, innocent victims of unscrupulous parents, were reciting scripts written by greedy adults. Even the love of his grandchildren, the last pure thing he thought he had, was a carefully orchestrated lie. Eduardo realized that the test had revealed a truth more terrible than any nightmare narrative break for engagement. His family, not only didn't love him, but actively considered him an obstacle to be removed as soon as possible. He was surrounded by strangers who bore his surname but had sold their souls for money. While Eduardo continued his performance as a dying man, his brilliant businessman's mind had already devised a revenge plan that would devastate his family as much as they had devastated his heart. If they wanted to put on a comedy, he would give them the ending they deserved. On the fourth morning, Eduardo called each of his children separately, pretending to want to share his final wishes. What he did instead was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that would have made the most ruthless strategist tremble. With Carlos, the traitor selling the company to competitors, Eduardo played the role of the father who finally recognized his son's merits. He promised him 60% of the shares and the company presidency, asking him to sign some documents to protect the company from inheritance taxes. Carlos, blinded by greed disguised as filial emotion, signed everything without reading carefully. In reality, he was signing detailed confessions of all his business betrayals. Miguel received the promise of all international real estate properties and 100 million in cash, on condition that he personally managed some sales procedures. He too enthusiastically signed documents that were actually written confessions of his fake relationship with Sofia and compromising from a tax perspective. Alejandro was manipulated with the promise of the art collection valued at 50 million and complete freedom for his artistic career. Moved to tears by his father's repentant words, he signed documents that accused him of theft and illegal sale of family goods. Isabel received 20 million to care for Carlos, and thinking of her future in Marbella, she enthusiastically signed documents that accused her of adultery and embezzlement. All the signed documents were immediately sent to the Madrid law firm with precise instructions to open them only after Eduardo's death or upon his written request. The real stroke of genius came on the fifth night when Eduardo called everyone to his room for what was supposed to be his final speech. With a weak voice and tearful eyes, he began a seemingly moving monologue about his mistakes as a father and his love for the family. For a moment, seeing the tears on his loved ones' faces, Eduardo thought he glimpsed a flash of genuine love. But Carlos ruined everything by whispering to his brother that it was perfect. Their father was dying with feelings of guilt, so the will would remain favorable. It was at that instant that Eduardo made his final decision. He would not only reveal the truth about his health condition, but would completely destroy the life of each member of his family. They had chosen to treat him as an obstacle to remove. He would show them what it meant to have a real enemy. The next day, Eduardo told Ramon to prepare everything for the grand finale. Everyone had to be gathered in the main hall along with the lawyer, notary, and journalists who were about to witness the show of their lives. The test was over. Now began the most ruthless settling of accounts in Spanish business history. On the morning of the seventh day, Eduardo prepared for the moment he had planned down to the last detail. He dressed in his best dark suit, the one for great occasions, and looked at himself in the mirror. The man who contemplated him was no longer the dying patriarch, but the fearsome businessman who had built an empire from nothing. At 10 o'clock sharp, Ramon gathered the entire family in the main hall of the mansion. The atmosphere was solemn. Everyone believed they had been summoned for Eduardo's final moments. Also present were lawyer Martinez, notary Fernandez, Dr. Mendoza, and, to everyone's surprise, 3 journalists from El País, ABC, and Hola. At 10:15, Eduardo came down the stairs, not with the uncertain step of a dying man, but with the confident stride of the leader he had always been. The silence in the hall became deafening when everyone saw him perfectly healthy, elegantly dressed, with the sharp gaze of one who controls the situation. Eduardo's first words were like a bomb exploding in the silence. He was not sick, he was not dying. Everything had been a test to see how his family would behave, thinking he was on the brink of death. Dr. Mendoza had simply played the role assigned to him. The pallor that painted the family members' faces was immediate and devastating. Isabel seemed about to faint. Miguel began to sweat visibly. Carlos tried to stammer a justification while Alejandro seemed paralyzed by shock. Eduardo approached a large screen prepared by Ramon and began the projection that would forever destroy the Garcia family. The videos recorded by hidden cameras showed every private conversation, every betrayal, every misdeed committed in the previous 6 days. One by one, Eduardo enumerated each person's guilt. Carlos had betrayed the company by selling secrets to competitors. Isabel had a lover in Marbella and had manipulated the children. Miguel had paid Sofia to fake a relationship. Alejandro had sold objects from the mansion and contacted gossip magazines. Each accusation was backed by irrefutable video and audio evidence. The journalists frantically took photos and notes, conscious of witnessing the greatest family scandal in the Spanish business world. But Eduardo wasn't finished. With a voice that became increasingly glacial, he revealed that everyone had signed complete confessions of their crimes, believing they were signing inheritance documents. The trap had closed perfectly around them. Desperate attempts at justification were swept away by overwhelming evidence. There was no escape, no possibility of denying the evidence. The Garcia family had been unmasked before the entire world. Eduardo turned toward lawyer Martinez, who opened a briefcase extracting a series of legal documents. The moment of sentencing had arrived, and the Garcia family waited in silence for a condemnation they knew would be devastating. The consequences announced by Eduardo were merciless and definitive. Carlos was fired from the company with immediate effect, reported for corporate treason and industrial espionage, and his inheritance reduced to zero. Isabel faced charges for adultery and embezzlement, while the grandchildren would be entrusted to Eduardo's sister until the parents proved themselves worthy. Miguel completely lost his inheritance. The promised real estate properties were donated to the Garcia Foundation for Orphan Assistance, and his tax crimes were already in the hands of the Treasury. Sofia, seeing the situation precipitating, left the mansion without looking back. Alejandro received the deepest stab. Eduardo admitted having always loved him for his supposed honesty, but discovering he was the greediest of all had broken his heart. His inheritance would go entirely to artistic projects for disadvantaged youth. The new will, read by the lawyer, destined 80% of the patrimony, 720 million euros, to the Carmen Garcia Foundation for Cancer Research. The rest went to loyal company employees. The mansion became a museum. The company was transformed into a workers' cooperative. Desperate attempts at contestation were rejected with the signed documents confessing their crimes. Eduardo granted them 1 hour to leave the mansion, promising that their personal effects would be sent. While the former children left the mansion like ghosts, followed by photographers' flashes, Eduardo remained in the hall with Ramon, Dr. Mendoza, and the lawyer. Looking at the gardens of La Moraleja shining under the December sun, the patriarch confessed he had built an empire for his family, but had discovered that family had become his worst enemy. 6 months later, the story of the patriarch's revenge went around the world. The Garcia company prospered as a cooperative. The Carmen Garcia Foundation financed revolutionary research, while the children tried in vain to take legal action, trapped by documents signed in their own hand. Eduardo lived his final years in the peace of knowing his empire was in worthy hands. He never saw his biological children again, but he symbolically adopted hundreds of orphaned children through his foundation. The patriarch had won the last battle of his life, that of dignity and honor of the Garcia name. He had demonstrated that even blood can betray, but true values are immortal. If this story has made you reflect on what family really means and the dangers of greed, which can destroy even the most sacred bonds, please like and share this video. Eduardo Garcia has taught us that sometimes the greatest love is the one that knows how to say enough when necessary. Don't miss the next episode where you'll discover another incredible story of how appearances can deceive and how truth always emerges. Subscribe and activate the bell to not miss stories that will make you reflect on life. Next video, A woman inherits her grumpy neighbor's house. What she finds in the basement shocks her.